Right, settle in, because tonight I want to talk to you about a few days in the summer of 2021 in the one corner of the continent where this story has absolutely no business happening. If you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, you know it as the rainy bit. The drizzle, the evergreens, the grey skies that hang around for 9 months of the year. Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, the land of coffee and flannel, and people who are weirdly proud of how much it rains. It's the part of the map you'd point to if someone asked you where in North America you'd be least likely to die of heat. And for almost everyone who lived there, that was just a fact of life. Mild summers, cool nights, the sort of place where you genuinely did not need air conditioning because the worst a July afternoon could throw at you was a slightly sweaty bus ride. And then, for about a week, in late June of that year, the place quietly became one of the hottest spots on Earth. I find this whole thing fascinating, and I'll be honest, a lot of why I find it fascinating is exactly because of where it happened. If you told me a town in Arizona hit a brutal temperature, I'd nod and move on. Deserts are hot, that's the deal. But when a little village in British Columbia, a place known for salmon and river canyons, posts a number hotter than anything ever officially recorded in Las Vegas, that's the kind of thing that makes me sit up and go, hang on, that can't be right. Except it was right. It happened. And then, almost as if the universe was making a point, that same village burned to the ground the very next day. So that's where we're headed tonight. Slowly, with no rush at all, we're going to wander through what actually happened during those days. And I do mean wander, because there's no exam at the end of this, and you're very welcome to fall asleep at any point. You won't miss a twist, there isn't one. It's just me talking through something I've spent far too long reading about. And you, hopefully drifting off somewhere around the bit about adiabatic compression, which is a phrase I will explain and which I promise is less intimidating than it sounds. I should say up front what kind of video this is so you know what you're getting. It's not a thriller. There's no music swelling toward a big reveal, no voice telling you that what comes next will shock you. I find that style exhausting at the best of times, and at 1 a.m, it's actively rude. So this is the opposite of that. It's a slow walk through a real event, told the way I'd tell it to a mate over a long drink, with all the tangents and the little asides and the bits where I get distracted by some detail I think is brilliant. If you fall asleep halfway through, that's not a failure, that's the entire point. I'll still be here. The story isn't going anywhere. Here's a rough map of where we'll meander. We'll start with the place itself, and why a region of 70-degree Juness had so few air conditioners that it mattered. We'll get into what a heat dome actually is in plain language, because the term gets thrown around a lot, and most people couldn't tell you what's physically going on up there. We'll talk about a genuinely strange detail involving moisture that travelled all the way from Southeast Asia. We'll sit with the human side of it, gently, because hundreds of people died and they deserve more than a number. We'll look at the village that broke a national record 3 days running and then was simply gone. And toward the end, we'll get into the part the title is really about, which is whether this comes back, and what scientists actually mean when they say it will. That last bit is worth a small honest aside before we begin. The title says the Northwest is about to relive this. I want to be straight with you, because I think over-promising is a bit rude. No scientist has circled a date on a calendar. Nobody is forecasting a specific summer. What they have done is something almost more unsettling in its quiet way. They've taken an event that was, in their own words, very nearly impossible, and shown that the warming world has moved it from the once in 1,000 years column into something that could turn up every handful of years within the working lifetime of people who are alive right now. So when I say relive, I don't mean a prophecy. I mean the category of thing has changed. The freak accident has been rescheduled as a recurring guest. We'll get there properly. For now, just know I'm not going to try to scare you to keep you watching, partly because that would be cruel, and mostly because the whole point of this channel is the opposite of keeping you awake. If you enjoy this sort of slow factual ramble and you'd like more of them, there's a subscribe button somewhere nearby, and pressing it does genuinely help. No pressure either way. It'll still be here in the morning. Now then, let's start with the place, because to understand why a heat wave became a disaster, you have to understand why nobody there was ready for it, and that story starts long before 2021, in the gentle grey weather that made the Pacific Northwest what it is. So let's spend a little time on the Pacific Northwest itself, because it really is the main character here, even more than the weather is. Picture the coastline, running up from Oregon through Washington and into British Columbia. To the west, you've got the cold Pacific, and that ocean does an enormous amount of quiet work, setting the mood of the whole region. Cool sea air drifts in off the water, the famous marine layer rolls over the cities in the mornings, and the result is a climate that is, by the standards of most of the planet, almost suspiciously pleasant in summer. Mild days, cool evenings, the kind of weather where you might want a light jacket in the morning, even in July. The average high in June, across a lot of the region, sits somewhere in the 60s or low 70s Fahrenheit, depending exactly where you are. That's around the high teens to low 20s if you think in Celsius. Lovely, forgiving, the sort of summer that doesn't ask much of you. And because the climate never really demanded it, the region grew up without one piece of kit that the rest of hot North America treats as non-negotiable: air conditioning. For generations, an AC unit in a Seattle home was a bit of an oddity. Why would you bother? You'd run it maybe 3 days a year, and even then mostly out of mild irritation rather than any real need. I've read that Seattle had, for a long time, one of the lowest rates of home air conditioning of any major city in the United States. People almost wore it as a badge of honour. We don't need AC up here. We've got the sea breeze. Open a window, you'll be fine. And here's the thing. They weren't wrong. For decades, they were completely right. That's what makes this such a quietly tragic setup, because the confidence was earned. It was based on a century of lived experience. Your gran could tell you she'd never once needed to cool her house, and she'd be telling the truth. The houses themselves were built for the climate they were in, lots of them designed to hold warmth through cool, damp winters, which is exactly the wrong instinct when the problem suddenly becomes too much heat rather than too little. Heavy insulation, windows that weren't built to dump heat at night, that sort of thing. Brilliant for a chilly Tuesday in February. Less brilliant when the house turns into a slow oven and won't let the day's heat back out after dark. There's a comparison I keep coming back to with this. It's a bit like how somewhere that never gets snow falls apart the moment it gets an inch of it. Not because an inch of snow is genuinely catastrophic, but because nobody owns a snow shovel, the roads have no grit, and nobody quite knows what to do. The hazard isn't the only thing that matters. What matters just as much is whether the place is set up to absorb it. And the Northwest, for all its competence and its lovely weather, was a region with no metaphorical snow shovels for heat. No habit of checking on the elderly neighbour during a hot spell, because there'd never really been a hot spell worth checking for. No cultural muscle memory at all. You also have to factor in the people, not just the buildings. The Northwest, like a lot of places, has an ageing population, and plenty of older folk living on their own. We'll come back to that properly later, because who the heat actually reached is its own subject, and an important one. But just hold the thought for now, that the region had a lot of people who were, without anyone really clocking it, sitting in exactly the conditions that make heat dangerous. Older, alone in a warm house, with no way to cool it, in a culture that had spent 100 years confidently telling itself this would never be a problem. There's a phrase you hear in the region, or used to, about the weather. People would talk about June gloom, that grey, overcast start to summer where the marine layer hangs about and the sun doesn't really commit until later in the day. And the funny thing is, people mostly liked it, or at least wore it with a kind of weary affection. It was theirs. It kept the tourists guessing and the gardens green. The whole identity of the place was bound up in being the soft, damp, temperate corner of the country, the antidote to the baking southwest. You moved to Seattle or Portland, partly to escape that kind of heat, not to find it. So the heat dome wasn't just a weather event for these people. It was, in a small way, an assault on how they understood the place they lived. The thing that was supposed to define their home, its gentleness, turned out to have an expiry date nobody had told them about. One more bit of texture I love, because it says everything about the regional mindset. When the forecasts started coming in ahead of June 2021, and they were good forecasts, the meteorologists saw this coming days out. The shops sold out of fans and portable air conditioning units almost immediately. People were suddenly scrambling to buy a thing they'd spent their whole lives mocking. There's something very human about that. The collective, slightly panicked realization that the one summer the breeze doesn't show up, you are genuinely on your own. So that's the stage. A cool, green, comfortable corner of the world, full of people and homes built around the reasonable assumption that it would stay cool, green, and comfortable. Now we need to talk about the thing that arrived and broke that assumption. And to do that properly, I want to actually explain what a heat dome is, because it's one of those terms that gets used constantly on the news without anyone ever stopping to say what's physically happening in the sky above your head. So let's do that next, nice and slowly. All right, the heat dome itself. Let's take this gently, because once you understand the basic mechanism, every other part of the story clicks into place, and it's genuinely satisfying when it does. You'll have heard the phrase, heat dome. It sounds like something out of a film, a great invisible bell jar lowered over a city, and honestly, that image isn't a million miles off, though the reality is a bit more interesting and a lot less deliberate than a dome being placed anywhere. It starts with high pressure. Now, high pressure is usually a friendly thing in a weather forecast. It's what gives you a clear, calm, sunny day. But imagine a really big, really stubborn area of high pressure parking itself over a region and refusing to budge. Up in the atmosphere, in a high pressure system, air is sinking. It's descending from higher up toward the ground. And here is the bit that does most of the work. The bit I promised I'd explain. When air sinks, it gets compressed, because the pressure down low is greater than the pressure up high. And when you compress a gas, it heats up. That's just physics. It's not the sun doing it. It's the squeezing itself that creates the warmth. The everyday version of this is a bicycle pump. If you've ever pumped up a tyre and noticed the pump getting warm in your hand, that warmth isn't friction, or not mostly. It's the air being compressed inside the pump. Same principle, much bigger scale. The atmosphere is pumping air downward, squeezing it, and the air warms up as it comes down. Scientists call this adiabatic warming, and I know that's a chunky word, but all it means is heating that comes from compression rather than from adding heat directly. That's it. You now understand a thing most people on the news cannot explain. So you've got this dome of high pressure with air sinking and warming inside it. And the high pressure does two more helpful things. Helpful for making it hot, not helpful for the people underneath. First, it clears the sky. Sinking air doesn't form clouds, so you get day after day of cloudless blue. And the sun just hammers down onto the ground with nothing to soften it. Second, it tends to calm the wind and block other weather systems from moving in. Normally, weather moves. Today's hot spell gets shoved along by tomorrow's cooler front. But a strong locked-in high-pressure ridge is like a boulder dropped in a stream. The flow has to go around it. So instead of moving on, the heat just sits there and bakes. And it builds on itself, which is the genuinely nasty part. Each day the sun heats the ground. Normally the night undoes a good chunk of that. Temperatures drop, the ground sheds its warmth to the sky, and you wake up reset. But under a heat dome, the trapped warm air holds the heat through the night too. The overnight low never falls far enough to give anyone, or anything, a proper break. So you don't start each day from scratch. You start it already warm, and then you pile another scorching day on top. Day 3 is hotter than day 2, which was hotter than day 1. The oven preheats itself. There's a particular shape this kind of blocking pattern can take in the upper atmosphere that meteorologists have a nice name for. They call it an omega block, because on the weather charts, the jet stream bends into a shape like the Greek letter omega, that big looping hump with two legs. The hump is the ridge of high pressure, sitting there, parked, while the weather that should be flushing it out gets diverted down and around the legs. When you see an omega block set up, you know you're in for a stretch of stubborn, unchanging weather. In summer, over the wrong place, that means heat that won't quit. There's a comparison I find useful here. The region had lived through heat domes before, plenty of them, across its recorded history. They're a recurring summer visitor, but none of those earlier ones had ever produced anything remotely like the 2021 numbers. So you can't just say, a heat dome did it, and leave it there, the way you might explain an ordinary hot week. A heat dome was the stage, the basic setup, but the magnitude of what happened needs more than the stage to explain it. It's a bit like noticing that a fire needs oxygen. True, but oxygen is always around, so the presence of oxygen alone doesn't explain why this particular fire was 1,000 times bigger than the last one. Something extra had to be feeding it. The heat dome was the oxygen. We're still hunting for the rest of what made this one burn so hot, and we'll come to the leading suspects shortly. So that's the engine. That, fundamentally, is what settled over the Pacific Northwest in late June 2021. A powerful ridge of high pressure, air sinking and compressing and warming, skies wiped clear, the whole system locked in place for days while the heat accumulated and the nights refused to cool. By itself, that mechanism explains a serious heat wave anywhere it happens. Heat domes are not rare. The region had seen plenty of them over the years, and so had lots of other places. But here's what's been nagging at scientists ever since, and what makes this particular event so strange. A normal heat dome, even a strong one, shouldn't have produced numbers like the ones the Northwest saw. The mechanism I've just described was running, yes, but it was running far, far hotter than it had any right to. Something extra was feeding it, something that pushed an already hot setup into territory that broke records not by a degree or two, but by enormous, almost embarrassing margins. And that something extra is one of my favourite details in this entire story, because it involves moisture and heat that came from absolutely miles away, from the other side of the Pacific Ocean, riding in on a river you cannot see. So let's talk about that next. So here's the detail that I genuinely think is the coolest part of the whole meteorological story. And it's the bit that almost never makes it into the headlines because it's a touch technical. But stay with me because it's lovely once it lands. The heat dome over the Northwest didn't cook up all on its own from local ingredients. A few days before the worst of it, on the other side of the Pacific, something was set in motion. There was an atmospheric river. Now, an atmospheric river is exactly what it sounds like. A long, narrow corridor of moisture flowing through the sky, carrying water vapour the way an actual river carries water. They're a normal feature of the climate. The Pacific Northwest knows them well, because in winter, they're the things that dump days of rain and cause flooding. Big ribbons of wet air sweeping in off the ocean. But this one was unusual. It was a summer atmospheric river, which is already a bit odd, and it had travelled an extraordinary distance. The moisture in it had origins all the way over near Southeast Asia, tied up with the monsoon systems over there. This great corridor of warm, moist air crossed the entire North Pacific, and some of the people who studied it gave it a rather good nickname. They called it the Oriental Express. I do love when scientists allow themselves a bit of flair. Now, why does a river of moisture coming from Asia make a heat wave in Oregon worse? It's a fair question, and the answer has two parts, both quite neat. The first part is about latent heat. When water vapour condenses, when it turns from gas back into liquid, forming clouds and rain, it releases heat. It's the reverse of the cooling you get when water evaporates. So as all that moisture in the atmospheric river condensed out over the Pacific, it was pumping warmth into the surrounding air. That preheated air mass, already warmer than it would otherwise have been, then got swept toward North America and fed into the developing ridge. So by the time the heat dome was setting up over the northwest, the air it had to work with was already starting from a higher baseline. The dome didn't have to do all the heating itself. It inherited a head start. The second part is the descent. Remember the sinking, compressing, warming air from the last section, the adiabatic business. That air, already pre-warmed by the condensation out over the ocean, then descended toward the surface, under the high pressure, and got compressed and heated even further on the way down. So you've got a double whammy. Air that was warmed once by the moisture it carried, and then warmed again by sinking and compressing. Two separate heating processes stacked on top of each other, both feeding the same pot. And there were other factors layered in beyond even that, because these big extreme events are never just one thing. Some researchers pointed to the way the jet stream and the planetary scale waves in the atmosphere had lined up in a particularly resonant pattern, the kind of alignment that makes a weather system unusually persistent and unusually amplified. There's also a wrinkle to do with the ground itself. The spring beforehand had been warm and on the dry side in places, and dry ground heats up faster than moist ground, because there's no moisture to evaporate and carry the heat away. So the land surface was primed to bake too. It all conspired. What I take from all this is a kind of humbling sense of how interconnected the atmosphere is. You've got monsoon activity near Southeast Asia, helping, days later and thousands of miles away, to set the conditions that killed people in Portland. That's not a tidy little local weather event. That's the entire Northern Hemisphere's atmosphere acting as one connected system, with a nudge in one place rippling out and amplifying into a catastrophe somewhere else entirely. I find that genuinely awe-inspiring in the old sense of the word, the sense that's a bit frightening as well as impressive. And it's also, I think, part of why scientists were so rattled by this event, which we'll get to, because when something extreme happens and you can point to one clean cause, you can at least feel like you understand it. But when it takes this many ingredients all lining up at once, an Asian atmospheric river, a resonant wave pattern, dry ground, a locked-in omega block, all of them stacking, it gets much harder to say how likely the whole combination really was, or how often it might happen again. We'll sit with that uncertainty properly later on. It's one of the more interesting threads. For now, though, I think we've earned a change of pace. We've done the meteorology, the engine, and the fuel. Let's actually look at what the thermometers said when all of this came together, because the numbers themselves are worth dwelling on. Not in a dramatic way, just in a let that sit with you way, because some of these figures are so far past what the region had ever seen that they almost don't sound real. Let's talk about the temperatures. I'll spread them out a bit rather than just rattling off a list, because a list of numbers is the fastest way to make your eyes glaze over. And while glazing over is sort of the goal here, I'd at least like you to take a couple of these in before you drift. Start with Portland, Oregon, big city, the heart of the Willamette Valley, the sort of place where a properly hot summer day historically meant the low 90s and a lot of complaining. Portland's all-time record high temperature, going into that June, was 107 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 42 Celsius. And that record had stood as the ceiling, the hottest it had ever been recorded, across well over a century of measurements. The absolute top of the scale. Over 3 days, Portland didn't just break that record, it dismantled it. On the 26th of June, it hit 108, a new all-time record. Fine, records get broken by a degree, it happens. The next day, the 27th, it reached 112, so the brand new record, less than 24 hours old, was already beaten by 4 degrees. And then on the 28th, the peak of the whole thing, Portland climbed to 116 degrees Fahrenheit. That's around 47 Celsius, 9 degrees past a record that had taken 100-odd years to set. I want to dwell on that for a second because the human mind is bad at scale, and that 9 degrees can slide past you. When you've got a century of daily measurements, records usually fall by tiny amounts. A degree, sometimes a fraction of one. To beat an all-time high by 9 degrees is so far outside how these things normally behave that meteorologists were openly saying they'd never seen anything like it. One forecaster put it well, the gist being that breaking a record by a degree or two is one thing, but breaking it by 4 or 5 in a place with over 100 years of data is just remarkable. And Portland did better, or worse, than 4 or 5. It did 9. It wasn't just Portland either. Salem, the state capital, a bit to the south, reached 117. Up in Washington, Seattle, which is right on the water and usually one of the milder spots, hit 108 degrees Fahrenheit. For Seattle, that's almost surreal. This is a city where topping 100 at all is a once-in-a-blue-moon event, where the whole place is built around the sea breeze, keeping things gentle. Before this, Seattle had only crept past about 100 a tiny handful of times in its entire recorded history, and here it was, sailing well past it. Even the coast cooked, which is the part that breaks my brain a little, because the coast is supposed to be the safe bit, the place you'd flee to. There were spots right on the Washington shore that hit temperatures in the low hundreds, smashing records that had been set with numbers in the 90s. The ocean, the great air conditioner of the entire region, simply got overwhelmed. And then there were the nights, which matter more than people think, and which I keep flagging because it's so important. I mentioned that under a heat dome, the overnight temperatures stay stubbornly high. Well, Portland recorded an overnight low that didn't drop below the low 70s. For context, that's warmer than a lot of the region's daytime highs in a normal summer. When the night never gets below the low 70s, a house that's been baking all day has no chance to cool down, and the people inside it never get the reprieve that lets a body recover. The day's heat just rolls straight into the next day's heat, with no gap. We'll get into exactly why that's so dangerous for the human body in a bit. For now, just hold on to the image of a night that brings no relief at all. There's a comparison I find clarifying. We tend to picture lethal heat as a desert thing. Death Valley, Phoenix, that sort of furnace. And those places do get hotter than what Portland saw, sure, but they're built for it. The buildings, the bodies, the habits, the air conditioning, all of it is adapted to extreme heat. What happened in the northwest was a desert-grade temperature, dropped onto a region with absolutely none of that adaptation. It's the difference between a wave hitting a seawall and the same wave hitting a sandcastle. The water's the same. What it lands on is everything. So those are the headline figures, and I'm going to be a bit disciplined about them, because I don't want to keep flinging the same numbers at you every 5 minutes, the way some documentaries do. I'll let that peak figure and the 9-degree gap and that warm night sit here, and I'll only bring them back once more, right at the end, if there's a good reason to. You've got them now. They're real. A famously cool, grey, maritime region spent 3 days as one of the hottest inhabited places on the planet. Now, one of those temperature records came with a story attached that is, on its own, one of the most haunting things in this whole episode. It happened a bit north, across the border, in a tiny village most people had never heard of. So let's go there next, and slow right down, because it deserves it. There's a village in British Columbia called Lytton. Before the summer of 2021, almost nobody outside of British Columbia had any reason to know the name. It's a small place, a few hundred people, tucked into a dramatic spot where 2 rivers meet in a deep canyon, the Fraser and the Thompson. The surrounding land includes the territory and communities of the Lytton First Nation, who have lived in that canyon for a very, very long time. It's the kind of place people describe with real affection. Someone who'd lived there called it magical, and from the photos I've seen, I get it. Big sky, big water, the canyon walls rising up all around. Lytton sits in a part of the interior that gets warmer than the coast. That's just the geography of it, away from the cooling ocean and down in a canyon where heat can pull. So when the dome settled in, Lytton was positioned to bake harder than almost anywhere. And it did. On the 27th of June, Lytton set a new all-time temperature record for the entire country of Canada. Not for the village, for Canada, the whole nation. And then it did it again the next day, and then a third time on the 29th, when the thermometer reached 49.6 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that's 121 degrees. I'll give you the comparison I teased earlier, because it still stops me cold. That is hotter than any temperature ever officially recorded in Las Vegas. A village in Canada, a country most of the world pictures under snow, was for a moment hotter than Las Vegas has ever been. The previous Canadian national record had stood for decades, and Lytton beat it by nearly 5 degrees Celsius, which, going back to what we said about how records usually fall, is an absurd margin. For 3 days, this tiny canyon village held the title of the hottest place in Canadian history. And you'd think that would be the whole story. A remarkable, almost unbelievable record. The sort of thing that gets a plaque. But the day after that third record, on the 30th of June, a fire started near the village. In conditions like those, with everything bone dry and superheated, and a wind picking up, fire moves in a way that's genuinely difficult to comprehend if you haven't seen it. The mayor of Lytton, a man called Jan Polderman, described noticing some smoke at the south end of town, and said that within 15 to 20 minutes, the whole town was engulfed. 15 to 20 minutes. People had almost no warning. The evacuation order went out, and the fire was already on top of them. Residents fled in their cars past burning homes, leaving belongings behind, just getting out with their lives. Around 1,000 people in and around the village had to run, along with the people of the neighbouring First Nation communities. By the time it was over, something like 90% of the village was gone. Not damaged, gone. The centre of town, the homes, the businesses, reduced to charred ground, with the odd brick chimney standing up out of the ash. 2 people died, and a place that had existed in that canyon, that had been someone's whole world, simply stopped existing as a town. There's a line from the mayor that I haven't been able to shake. He said something to the effect of, "I'm 60, and I thought climate change was a problem for the next generation. And now I'm the mayor of a town that no longer exists." I think about that a lot. The quiet shock in it. The sense of a timeline collapsing, of a thing you'd filed under later arriving now on your watch, taking the actual place you live. The cause of the fire, for what it's worth, was investigated thoroughly, and the official conclusion years later was that they simply couldn't determine what started it. There was no evidence it was set deliberately. It remains, in the formal sense, undetermined, and the recovery has been long and painful and slow. Years on, with a great deal of money committed to rebuilding, the village still hadn't properly come back. Rebuilding a town from nothing is enormously hard, especially a small one, and there were arguments and delays and the ordinary grinding difficulty of putting a place back together when the place itself is gone. There's a geographic detail worth lingering on, because it explains why Lytton of all places posted that number, and it's the kind of thing I find quietly satisfying. The village sits down in a canyon, away from the moderating ocean, and canyons have a way of trapping and concentrating heat. Air gets funneled and warmed as it moves through them, and the steep walls hold the warmth in like the sides of a bowl. So Lytton already ran hotter than the coast on an ordinary summer day. Drop a record-shattering heat dome on top of a spot that's geographically primed to bake, and you get the conditions for a national record. It wasn't random that it happened there. The place was, in a sense, built by its own landscape to be the hottest point on the map when the dome arrived. And then there's the long aftermath, which doesn't make headlines the way the fire did, but says a lot about how these things actually play out. Rebuilding a town from nothing turns out to be enormously, grindingly hard, even with serious money committed to it. Years passed and large amounts of recovery funding were earmarked by the provincial and federal governments, and still the village struggled to properly come back. There were delays and disputes and the ordinary impossible difficulty of reconstructing a place when the place itself, the homes, the records, the infrastructure, all of it is simply gone. Even the question of who should lead the recovery and how the new community buildings would be paid to run became its own slow saga. 4 and 5 years on, Lytton was still very much a town in the process of trying to exist again, rather than a town that had recovered. There's something about that slow, unglamorous struggle that stays with me almost more than the dramatic night of the fire. The fire took the place in under an hour. Putting it back has taken years, and it isn't finished. I don't really want to dress this section up with any neat lesson. It doesn't need one, and it would feel a bit cheap. It's just a small, true, terrible thing that happened inside the bigger thing. A village set a national heat record 3 days running, and then it burned down in the time it takes to make a cup of tea. Both of those facts are real, and they happen to the same few hundred people in the same few days. And I think the right response is mostly just to sit quietly with it for a moment. So we'll do that, and then, because the heat reached far more people than just that one village, I want to turn to the human side of the wider event. But first, gently, to the body itself, and why this kind of heat does what it does, because understanding the machinery makes everything that follows make a lot more sense. Let's talk about the human body in the heat, because I think once you understand how the cooling system works, you understand exactly why a few hot days can quietly become a mass casualty event, and why it reached the people it did. Here's the foundation. Your body is, all the time, producing heat. You can't switch it off. Every cell is burning fuel just to keep you alive, and warmth is the byproduct, the same way an engine throws off heat while it runs. Even sitting completely still, you're putting out roughly the warmth of an old-fashioned light bulb, and your core, the deep inside where your organs live, has to stay within a really narrow band of temperature, right around 37 Celsius, which is 98.6 Fahrenheit. Push that core up by just a few degrees, and you're in serious trouble. Push it up enough, and the proteins that run your body start to fail. So your body's constantly doing a balancing act, heat coming in, heat going out, trying to keep that core steady. On a cool day, this is easy. The air around you is colder than you are, so your warmth just flows out into the air on its own, the way a hot cup of tea cools down in a cool room. No effort required. But on a hot day, when the air is as warm as you or warmer, that free escape route closes. Heat stops flowing out of you, and if the air is hotter than your body, heat actually starts flowing the wrong way, into you. That's when your body reaches for its one big trick, the thing that lets a human survive somewhere hotter than the human body itself. You sweat. Sweating is genuinely one of the most underrated abilities we have, and we mostly just think of it as the annoying thing that ruins a shirt. But it's a marvel. Here's the physics, and it's simple, and rather beautiful. When water evaporates, when it changes from liquid into vapor, it absorbs energy. It has to. Breaking those bonds takes heat, and that heat gets pulled out of whatever the water is sitting on. So when sweat evaporates off your skin, the energy needed to lift it into the air comes straight out of your body. Your skin cools, the blood just under it cools, and that cooled blood circulates back inside and carries the chill into your core. You've turned your own skin into a radiator. It's why a breeze feels so good when you're hot and damp, and why stepping out of a pool on a windy day can make you shiver, even when the air is warm. The water's evaporating off you fast, stealing your heat to do it. And here's the catch, the bit the whole thing hinges on. The cooling doesn't come from sweat appearing on your skin. It comes from sweat evaporating off your skin. Those are different things. If the sweat can't evaporate, it does nothing. It just sits there, drips off, soaks your clothes, and wastes your body's water and salts for no benefit at all. Now, the Northwest event was mostly what you'd call dry heat, not the suffocating humid kind. So evaporation could still happen reasonably well. That actually meant a healthy person with water, shade, and rest had a fighting chance. But, and this is crucial, even a well-functioning sweat system has limits, and several things were stacked against the people there. The first is acclimatization, and this is the big one for the Northwest specifically. Your body can actually adapt to heat over time, People who live in hot places gradually become more efficient at it. They start sweating sooner, they sweat more, their hearts handle the load better. It's a real physiological adjustment that takes a couple of weeks of exposure. The people of the Pacific Northwest had none of it. They had spent their entire lives in mild conditions. Their bodies had never been trained for that kind of heat, because that kind of heat had never happened. So they were hit with desert-grade heat, while carrying, in effect, no heat fitness at all. A body in Phoenix and a body in Seattle facing the same temperature are not facing the same danger, because one has spent a lifetime adapting and the other hasn't. The second thing is that even with sweating working, the heart pays a heavy price. To cool you, your body has to pump huge amounts of warm blood out to the skin, and that's hard work for the heart. For a young, healthy heart, fine. For an older heart, or a heart already dealing with disease, that strain can be the thing that tips into a medical emergency. And a lot of the people most exposed had exactly those vulnerable hearts. When the cooling finally loses the race, when the core temperature starts climbing and won't come back down, that's heat stroke. And it's a true emergency where minutes matter. The body's internal temperature rises, the heart races, blood pressure can drop, and as the core climbs past about 40 Celsius, the brain itself starts to malfunction. The person gets confused, disoriented, may stop making sense or lose consciousness. And the cruelest detail of all is that confusion is one of the early symptoms, which means the very ability you'd need to recognize you're in danger and act on it is one of the first things the heat takes away. Someone in real trouble often can't tell they're in trouble. They don't think, I must get help. They just get muddled and quiet and slip further. There's one more wrinkle worth understanding, and it's about speed, because heat stroke can move alarmingly fast once it starts. People sometimes imagine it as a slow, gradual decline you'd have plenty of time to react to. But once the cooling system genuinely fails and the core temperature begins to climb out of control, the deterioration can be quick, a matter of hours rather than days. And it tends to accelerate, because a hotter core makes the brain work worse, which makes the person less capable of helping themselves, which lets the core climb further. It feeds on itself. That's part of why early intervention matters so much, and why so many of the people who reached full heat stroke during the event could not be saved, even with aggressive cooling, once they got to hospital. By the time the damage is done, it's often genuinely too late, no matter how good the medical care. The window where you can actually do something is earlier, before the worst of it, which is exactly the window when the person is least likely to realise they need help. And there's the matter of water, which is more complicated than it sounds. Everyone knows you should drink water in the heat, and you should. But water only helps you insofar as it keeps you able to sweat. If the conditions are such that you simply can't shed enough heat, drinking won't save you on its own, because the bottleneck isn't your supply of fluid, it's whether your body can get rid of the heat fast enough. Worse, in prolonged extreme heat, you're losing not just water, but salts through all that sweating, and replacing the water without the salts can cause its own problems. So the simple advice to drink lots of water, while sensible, can give people a false sense that they've handled the danger, when in a severe enough event the heat is overwhelming the whole system regardless. It's a sobering thought that the instinct everyone reaches for first is helpful, but nowhere near as protective as we tend to assume. That's the machinery, and I'll leave it there rather than going over it again later, because I think it's clear enough now. Hold on to two things from it. One, the Northwest's lack of acclimatization made the same heat far more dangerous there than it would be elsewhere. And two, the people whose bodies were least able to run this cooling system, the old, the unwell, were always going to be the ones it reached first. Which brings us, gently, to who the heat actually took. I want to do this part carefully because it's the part that matters most. And it's very easy to turn people into statistics when you're talking about a disaster. So let's slow down and actually think about who these people were. There's a county in Oregon called Multnomah, which is where Portland mostly sits. is the most populous county in the state, and it was hit about as hard as anywhere. In the months after the heat wave, the county put together a careful report on the people who died there, and the details in it tell you almost everything about how heat actually kills, which is to say quietly, indoors, and unequally. 72 people died in Multnomah County, and when they looked at who those 72 were, a very clear and very sad pattern emerged. Most of them were older. 48 of them, 2/3, lived alone. And the cooling, or the lack of it, turned out to be the thing that mattered most of all. 49 of the people who died had either just a fan or no cooling unit of any kind. No air conditioning at all in a house that, as we talked about, was probably built to hold warmth rather than release it, during the hottest days that region had ever recorded. Sit with that picture for a second. An older person, on their own, in a flat or a house with the windows open and a fan pushing hot air around the room, getting slowly, invisibly overwhelmed. No dramatic moment, no alarm, just a body that couldn't shed the heat, in a place that offered no escape from it, with nobody there to notice something was wrong. And remember what we said about confusion being an early symptom. Many of these people likely became muddled before they could think to call anyone, even if there had been anyone to call. The geography within the county told its own story too. The deaths weren't spread evenly. They clustered. They concentrated in East Portland and in the downtown core, and those areas line up almost exactly with what are called urban heat islands, the parts of a city with the most pavement and the fewest trees, where roads and buildings soak up the day's heat and hold it. And those hotter neighbourhoods tended to be the lower income ones. So the heat sorted its victims not just by age and by isolation, but by which part of the city a person could afford to live in. The leafier, wealthier, shadier areas ran cooler and safer. The poorer, more paved areas ran hotter and deadlier. That's not a coincidence, and it's a pattern that turns up in heat disaster after heat disaster, all over the world. Heat is, in its quiet way, one of the most unequal hazards there is. And it wasn't only the elderly and isolated, though they were the largest group. The reports from across the region include people you might not immediately picture. There was a farm labourer, an immigrant worker, who collapsed and died while working at a plant nursery out in a rural part of Oregon during the worst of it. People who work outdoors don't get to wait out a heat wave indoors. Their bodies are generating enormous extra heat from physical effort, on top of everything the environment is throwing at them, and a lot of them can't simply down tools and go home. There were people experiencing homelessness who had no indoors to retreat to at all, and there were the very old, including, in one account I read, someone who was 97 years old. A life that long, ended by a few hot days. Here's the thing that I keep turning over, and it's more of a personal reflection than a fact. Heat is the deadliest weather hazard there is in the United States. It kills more people in a typical year than floods, than tornadoes, than hurricanes, than lightning. And yet it's the one almost nobody fears properly. And I think the reason is precisely that it's so undramatic. A hurricane gives you footage, flattened houses, flooded streets, a clear before and after you can point a camera at. Heat gives you none of that. The buildings are all still standing. The streets look completely normal. The damage is entirely inside people, mostly old people, mostly alone, often not discovered for days. There's nothing to film, and so a thing that kills more people than any of the photogenic disasters gets treated as a footnote, an inconvenience, a reason to complain about your commute. I find that genuinely sobering. The quietest killer is also the biggest one, and it gets the least respect, largely because it has the bad manners to do its work invisibly. So when we talk about hundreds of deaths in this event, I don't want it to wash over you as a round number. It was individual people, in individual rooms on individual nights when the air just wouldn't cool. Mostly old, mostly alone, mostly without the one machine that could have saved them. Now, Multnomah County was just one county. The full toll stretched across 2 American states and a Canadian province, and the total is both larger and, in an interesting way, harder to pin down than you'd expect. So let's widen the lens and talk about the region-wide picture, and about why counting the dead from a heat wave is genuinely difficult. If you widen out from that one county to the whole affected area, the picture gets bigger, but oddly, also blurrier. And the blurriness is itself one of the more interesting things about heat as a hazard, so I want to spend a little time on it. The commonly cited figure for the whole event across Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia is somewhere around 800 deaths. That's the number you'll see most often when people summarize it. But I want to be honest about that number, because it's not as solid as it sounds, and the reasons it isn't are worth understanding. Let's take British Columbia, where it hit hardest. The provincial coroner's office, in the days during and right after the heat, started reporting a surge of what they called sudden and unexpected deaths. The numbers came in fast and kept climbing. When the dust settled and they did a proper analysis, they estimated somewhere in the region of 740 excess deaths in the province over an 8-day stretch. Now, that word excess is doing important work, and it's the key to how you actually count a heatwave. So let me unpack it. You can't always look at a death and say with certainty, that one was the heat, especially with older people who had other conditions. Someone with a weak heart who dies on the hottest day of the century, was it the heart or was it the heat? In a sense, it was both. The heat pushed the heart past what it could handle. So instead of trying to label each individual death, scientists do something cleverer. They ask, how many people would we normally expect to die in this province over these 8 days, based on every previous year? And then they ask, how many actually died? And the gap between those two numbers, the excess, is the heat's signature. In British Columbia, that gap meant deaths ran roughly 95% above normal over that period, almost double the usual death rate for that stretch of the calendar. That's an enormous spike, and it's about as clear a fingerprint as this kind of event ever leaves. The undercounting goes deeper still in a way I find genuinely interesting and a bit unsettling. Even those excess death counts probably miss people. There was a study done later in Washington state that looked beyond the obvious heat deaths and asked a slightly different question. They looked at deaths from injuries, things like drownings, transport accidents, and other causes that nobody would automatically file under heatwave. And they found that in the 3 weeks beginning the 25th of June, there were around 159 additional injury deaths beyond what you'd normally expect. Drownings because people desperate to cool off went into cold water they weren't ready for. Accidents because extreme heat affects judgment and reaction time and tempers. Heat, it turns out, doesn't just kill through heat stroke. It ripples out into all sorts of deaths that never get the heat written on the certificate. The lead researcher on that one had a line I liked about how the official death tolls might miss deaths that weren't obviously tied to the temperature, but that even the deaths that were counted might be just the tip of the iceberg. And then she added, rather dryly, that the iceberg was a poor choice of metaphor for a heatwave. Which, fair enough, but you take the point. The number we settle on for an event like this is almost always an undercount. The true reach of it is wider than any tidy figure can capture. I think this is genuinely one of the most important things to understand about heat, and it connects back to what I was saying before about why it gets so little respect. Not only is the dying invisible, because it happens quietly indoors, but the counting is invisible too. The toll has to be reconstructed afterward by statisticians comparing this year to other years, rather than simply tallied up at the scene the way you'd count houses lost in a flood. There's no moment where someone stands in front of a camera and says, the final number is X, and everyone nods. It emerges slowly in reports and studies that come out months and years later, long after the public has moved on, which means the event lands in the collective memory as smaller than it actually was. So when I say hundreds died, and the round figure of 800 gets used, just hold it loosely. The real meaning of it isn't the precise number. It's that a region not built for heat, full of people not adapted to heat, got hit by the worst heat it had ever seen, and the result was a death rate that nearly doubled for over a week across an entire province, plus a long tail of further deaths that we can only estimate. That's the shape of it. Not a clean number, but a clear and very large signature in the data. It's worth setting this alongside a couple of other famous heat disasters, just for a sense of scale and company, because the Northwest event sits in a particular lineage of these things. There was a heat wave in Chicago back in 1995 that killed hundreds of people, and which became a sort of landmark study in how heat finds the isolated and the elderly, a pattern that repeated almost exactly in the Northwest decades later. There was the European heat wave of 2003, which we'll come back to properly near the end, that killed tens of thousands across the continent. And there was a brutal heat wave in Moscow in 2010 that similarly drove deaths into the tens of thousands. What strikes me, looking across all of them, is how consistent the story is. Different countries, different decades, different exact weather, and yet the same grim pattern underneath. The heat finds the old, the alone, the poor, the people without cooling, and it does its work quietly indoors, while the streets look perfectly normal. The Northwest in 2021 was a new entry in a very old and very consistent ledger. The setting was unusual, a region that had never faced this, but the way the heat behaved once it arrived, who it reached and how, was depressingly familiar to anyone who'd studied the others. Right, that's the heaviest stretch of the whole video, I think, and you've stayed with me through it, which I appreciate. Let's lift the mood a touch, or at least change its texture, and look at what the heat did to the stuff of the region. The roads, the power lines, the wildlife, the fruit on the trees. Because heat this extreme doesn't just affect people. It bends and warps the physical world in ways that are genuinely strange to read about, and a fair few of them I'd never have guessed. This is the section where I get to be a bit of a magpie, picking up shiny odd facts about what extreme heat does to the physical world, because there's something oddly soothing about a list of strange consequences when none of them is a person. So let's wander through the stranger side effects of the heat dome. Let's start with the roads, because this one genuinely surprised me the first time I read it. In Washington, the heat got so intense that sections of pavement actually buckled. We're talking about parts of Interstate 5, one of the major motorways on the West Coast, and other state routes where the road surface heated up, expanded, and physically warped and cracked. Lanes had to be closed. Now roads are designed with a bit of give in them, expansion joints and so on, to cope with the surface getting hot in summer. But they're designed for that region's normal hot, not for desert temperatures dropped onto tarmac that's never had to deal with them. So the road, like everything else, was caught out. There's something almost cartoonish about heat so severe it makes the motorway pop up out of the ground. But it happened, and it's a neat little illustration of the same theme running through this whole story. Everything there was built for a cooler world. The power infrastructure had its own troubles. In some places, the heat affected the cables and the systems that carry electricity. At the exact moment, everyone was desperately trying to run whatever cooling they had. Public transport felt it too. There were transit services that had to suspend or curtail operations, partly for the safety of crews and equipment, partly because the systems themselves don't love operating in that kind of heat. Even the cables that some trains run on can be affected by extreme temperatures. The whole built environment, in other words, started to strain and fail in small ways, all at once. Then there's the shopping side, which I find very human. As I mentioned earlier, fans and portable air conditioners sold out almost instantly. Hardware shops, big retailers all cleaned out. If you hadn't bought a cooling unit before the rush, you simply weren't getting one, because there were none left for any money. Cities scrambled to open cooling centres, public spaces with air conditioning where people could go to escape, set up in libraries, community centres, convention halls. People went and sat in them, sometimes for days. There are photographs of folk resting on cots in big convention halls, just riding it out in the one cool room available to them. Baseball games got cancelled or moved. Outdoor vaccination clinics, this being 2021, had to be called off. The ordinary rhythm of life just stopped because going outside became genuinely hazardous. Now for the natural world, which is where some of the most haunting details live. Along the coastline, the heat cooked marine life in vast numbers. There were estimates of enormous quantities of shellfish, mussels and clams and the like dying on the shore, essentially baked in place during low tide when they were exposed to the air and the brutal sun. If you've ever turned over a rock at the beach and seen all the little creatures clinging to it, picture that, but with the heat so severe that they simply couldn't survive the exposure. Some estimates of the marine die-off ran into the staggering numbers. More than 1 billion small sea creatures along stretches of the coast. Whole shorelines turned into something out of a grim, still life. The plants suffered too in ways that affected people's livelihoods. This is prime growing country, especially for fruit, and the heat scorched crops right on the branch and the vine. Berries cooked. There were images of blackberries and other fruit essentially cooked where they grew, ruined before they could be picked. Tree leaves got scorched brown. Cherry and other fruit harvests took real damage. For farmers, a heat wave like this isn't an abstract climate story. It's this year's income gone in 3 days. And the heat reached up into the mountains too, which is a detail I find quietly significant. The Pacific Northwest stores a lot of its water as snowpack up in the high country, and that snow melts gradually through the warmer months to feed rivers and reservoirs. The heat dome hit that snowpack hard, causing rapid, early melting, even in the cooler, higher elevations that are usually more protected. Researchers who looked at it found this event drove some of the most dramatic early season snowmelt they'd seen, including in the most stubborn, persistent patches of snow that normally hang on. That matters because it's not just a 1-week problem. Lose your mountain snow too early, and you affect the water supply for the rest of the season. There's one more knock-on effect that I think deserves a mention because it connects this event to the fire we already talked about in Lytton, and to fires more broadly. Heat like this doesn't just hurt in the moment, it primes the landscape to burn. When you superheat a region for days, you dry out the vegetation, the grass, the brush, the forest floor, turning it all into tinder. So a heat dome doesn't only kill people directly, it loads the gun for the wildfire season that follows. In the days during and after the 2021 event, the number of new fires reported across British Columbia jumped sharply, dozens of them springing up in a single 24-hour stretch. Lytton was the most famous, but it was far from alone. The heat and the fire are not two separate stories. They're the same story, with the heat setting the conditions and the fire arriving to finish the job. It's a grim little partnership, and it's one of the reasons these extreme heat events cast a much longer shadow than the few days the thermometer is actually high. What I take from this whole grab bag is a sense of how total the event was. It wasn't just uncomfortable for people, it reached into the roads, the power grid, the sea, the orchards, and the mountains all at once. The heat touched basically every system, natural and built, that the region runs on, and found each of them unprepared in its own particular way. Pretty wild when you lay it all out next to each other. All right, we've covered what happened and what it did. Now I want to turn to the question that I think is the most genuinely fascinating of all, and it's a scientific one. How rare was this really? Because the answer the scientists came back with was so strange that it unsettled the very people who calculated it. So let's get into the attribution story next. Now we get to the bit that I think is the most intellectually interesting part of this entire story, and it's about a field of science that I find genuinely clever. It's called attribution science, and it tries to answer a question that used to be considered almost impossible to answer. The question is, did climate change cause this particular event? For a long time, scientists were very cautious about ever linking a single weather event to climate change. The standard line was that You can't blame any one storm or heat wave on the warming climate. You can only talk about long-term trends. And that's a sensible, careful instinct. But over the last decade or so, researchers got much better at actually running the numbers on individual events. The way they do it, roughly, is they use a load of climate models to simulate two worlds. One is the world as it actually is, with all the warming humans have caused. The other is a sort of parallel world, a simulation of the climate as it would have been without that human-caused warming. And then they ask, how likely was this event in each world? If it's far more likely in the real warmed world than in the imaginary unwarmed one, that's the fingerprints of climate change on that specific event. After the Northwest heat wave, a large international team got together under a banner called World Weather Attribution and did exactly this, and they did it fast, within about 10 days of the event. 27 scientists, and the conclusion they reached is one of the strongest I've ever seen come out of this kind of study. They found that the heat wave would have been, in their words, virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. Not less likely, not a bit rarer, virtually impossible. They estimated it was made at least 150 times more likely by climate change, and possibly far more than that. The exact figure was hard to pin down, because the event was so extreme, it sat almost off the edge of what the models could handle. One of the leaders of the group put it about as plainly as a scientist ever will. The basic message was, without climate change, this event would not have happened. That's a remarkable thing for a careful researcher to say out loud about a specific week of weather. I want to give attribution science a bit more credit, actually, because the more you think about how it works, the more impressive it is. You can't run an experiment on the planet. You can't take Earth, remove the human warming, and rerun the summer of 2021 to see what would have happened. So instead they do it in simulation, hundreds and hundreds of times over, modelling both the real climate and the hypothetical unwarmed one, and looking at how often an event this extreme turns up in each. It's a bit like rolling two enormous sets of weighted dice thousands of times each and comparing how often each set produces a particular rare result. If the real climate dice produce it vastly more often than the unwarmed dice, you've got your answer about the influence of warming. It's statistics standing in for an experiment we can never actually run, and when the gap between the two sets of dice is as enormous as it was here, the conclusion gets very hard to argue with. That's how you get to a phrase as strong as virtually impossible from what is, underneath, a very careful piece of number crunching rather than a hunch. But here's the part that I find the most fascinating, and it's the part that quietly worried the scientists themselves. Even in today's warmed climate, even accounting for all the human-caused warming, their analysis suggested this event should still have been something like a once-in-a-thousand-years occurrence. Think about what that means. They were essentially saying, we can confidently tell you climate change made this possible. And yet, even with climate change factored in, this still shouldn't have happened. It was extreme even by the standards of our hotter world, and that left them in a genuinely uncomfortable spot, scientifically, because there are really only two ways to read a result like that. One possibility is that the Northwest just got staggeringly, almost unbelievably unlucky, a genuine 1,000-year roll of the dice that happened to come up. The other possibility, and this is the one that some of the authors lean toward, is more unsettling. It's that the science is still missing something, that our models don't yet fully capture how climate change is making extreme heat more likely, and that events like this might actually be less rare than the models say because there's some mechanism we haven't properly accounted for. One of the scientists involved said as much, that it raised serious questions about whether we really understand how climate change is making heat waves hotter and more deadly. I love that, and I mean that sincerely, not because the implication is good, it isn't, but because it's such an honest piece of science. Here you've got researchers, fresh off producing a headline-grabbing finding, and instead of just taking the win and saying, look how clever we are, climate change did it, they turned around and said, actually this bothers us, because our own models say This shouldn't have happened even in the warmed world, and that means we might be underestimating the danger. That's scientists doing the hard, humble thing of pointing at the gap in their own understanding. Scientists basically saying, this is alarming partly because we can't fully explain it, and the fact that we can't fully explain it might mean it's worse than we thought, not better. And remember what we talked about a few sections back, all those ingredients that stacked up to make this happen. The atmospheric river from Asia, the resonant wave pattern, the dry ground, the locked-in block. That complexity is part of why pinning down the exact rarity is so hard. When something needs that many things to line up at once, the statistics get genuinely difficult. It's one thing to estimate how often a simple event happens. It's another to estimate the odds of a very specific combination of rare ingredients all arriving together. So where does that leave us? With a finding that's both clear and disquieting at the same time. Clear in that climate change unambiguously made this event possible. Disquieting in that even our best science found it nearly impossible anyway, which means either we witnessed a true freak, or we don't yet fully grasp the rules of the new game we're playing. Both of those are worth losing a little sleep over, though hopefully not tonight. And it sets up the question the whole title rests on perfectly. Because if this was a 1,000-year event, you might reasonably think, well, that's grim, but it won't happen again for a very long time. The trouble is, that's not what the science says about the future at all. The rarity of this event is not a fixed thing. It's a moving target, and it's moving fast. So let's talk about that next, properly and honestly. Right, this is the heart of what the title is really getting at. So let me take real care with it, because this is exactly the kind of thing that gets twisted into scaremongering. And I'd rather just tell you straight what the science actually says. We just talked about that 1,000-year figure, the idea that even in today's climate, this event was something like a once-in-a-1,000 years roll of the dice. And there's an even more striking way some analyses frame the comparison with the past. Set against the pre-industrial climate, the world before we'd warmed it, an event like this was so far outside the range of what was physically plausible that the numbers become almost meaningless. Some estimates put it at 1 in tens of thousands of years, and one preliminary calculation pushed it to something like 1 in 150,000 years, which is really just a mathematical way of saying it basically could not have happened in the old climate at all, which is what virtually impossible means in plain English. Now here's the trap people fall into, and it's a very natural one. You hear 1,000-year event or 10,000-year event, and your brain files it under, fine sorted, won't see that again in my lifetime or my grandchildren's. And if the climate were stable, that instinct would be reasonable. But the climate is not stable, it's warming. And the whole point about these rarity figures is that they are not fixed. They describe how rare the event is in a particular climate. Change the climate, and you change the odds. That's the part that really matters, and it's the part the title is built on. So what happens to the odds as the world keeps warming? The same scientists ran that projection, and the answer is the genuinely sobering bit. They looked at a world with 2 degrees Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels. I'll come back to what 2 degrees means and when it might arrive, because that's important context. But in that 2-degree world, an event of this kind, this thing that was virtually impossible, this 1,000-year freak, would become something that could be expected to recur roughly every 5 to 15 years. Some framings of it land around every 5 to 10 years. Let that contrast just sit there for a moment, because it's stark. We go from an event so rare it shouldn't have happened even in the warmed climate of 2021 to an event you'd expect every 5 to 15 years. That is not a small shift. That is a category change. It's the difference between a thing that happens once in recorded memory and a thing that happens a couple of times a decade. Something that turns up every 5 to 15 years isn't a freak anymore. It's a feature. It's a regular part of the climate. It's the sort of thing a region has to build around. the way the Northwest already builds around its rainy winters. And this is exactly why I was careful with you right at the start about the title. The title says the Northwest is about to relive this disaster. I want to keep being honest. Nobody can tell you it'll be next summer, or the one after, or the one after that. The science doesn't make predictions that precise, and anyone who claims it does is selling something. What the science does say with real confidence is that the thing has fundamentally changed its nature. It has moved out of the column marked once in 1,000 years, basically impossible, and into the column marked expect it every handful of years. The freak accident has been rescheduled as a recurring appointment. There's a phrase one of the researchers used about this, that our rapidly warming climate is bringing us into uncharted territory. And I think uncharted is exactly the right word, because the unsettling truth underneath all of this is that the rules keep changing while we're still trying to learn them. The Northwest spent 100 years building a confident understanding of its own weather, and that understanding was correct for the climate it was based on. But the climate it was based on is gone. The reference points people trusted, the it's never been hotter than this, the we don't get weather like that here, those reference points are quietly expiring. The 2-degree mark I keep mentioning deserves a word, because it's the hinge of the whole projection, and it's closer than people imagine. 2 degrees of warming above the pre-industrial baseline is not some distant, end-of-century problem for the robots number. The planet has already warmed well over 1 degree. On the path we're currently on, 2 degrees could arrive in something like 2 decades, possibly the 2040s. That's within the working life of a young adult today, and within the retirement of someone middle-aged now. So when scientists say an event like this would recur every 5 to 15 years in a 2-degree world, they're not describing a world your distant descendants will inhabit. They're describing a world that plenty of people alive right now are likely to live to see. So that, stripped of any drama, is what the title means. Not a prophecy of a specific summer, a genuine science-backed shift in the kind of place the Pacific Northwest now is, somewhere that the impossible has become merely occasional. And here's the thing that makes it feel less like an abstract projection and more like something already underway. The region hasn't exactly been quiet since 2021. It keeps brushing up against serious heat year after year. So let's look at the near misses, the heat events that have rolled through in the time since, because they're the clearest sign that the new normal isn't waiting politely for 2040. It's already started showing up. So the heat dome of 2021 wasn't a one-off that the region then got to forget about. In the years since, the Pacific Northwest has had a steady run of serious heat, and while none of it has matched that one extraordinary week, the pattern of it tells you something. The place keeps getting reminders. The very next summer, 2022, brought a long grinding heat wave to the region. Portland had a stretch of consecutive days at or above 95 degrees that put it in the running to tie its record for the longest such streak. And there's a detail from that one that's worth noting. Climate experts pointed out that week-long heat spells used to be genuinely rare in the Northwest, and they're becoming less rare. It's not just the single, jaw-dropping peak temperature that's changing. It's the duration. The heat is learning to stick around, which, as we talked about with the way these events compound day after day, is its own kind of danger. Even at lower peaks, a heat wave that lasts a week wears people down in a way a 2-day spike doesn't. Then 2024 came along and made the same point in numbers. There's a statistic from Oregon that genuinely stopped me when I read it. Since 2020, Eugene had logged something like 14 days above 100 degrees, and Portland around 16. And the striking part is that a large chunk of all the 100-degree days those cities had ever recorded across their entire history of measurements had happened just in those last few years. Let that land gently. It's not that hot days were always part of the picture, and there are simply a few more now. It's that the recent past is carrying a wildly disproportionate share of the extreme days. The graph isn't drifting upward, it's bending. Summer 2024 also brought its own heat waves, with Portland and the wider region pushing past 100 again and the familiar routine kicking in. The heat advisories, the warnings, the worry about people without cooling. By this point, sadly, the region had learned the drill, which is its own quiet kind of progress, and we'll talk about that. And then 2025 kept it going. There were heat waves through that summer too, including spells in August where temperatures in parts of Washington tied or threatened all-time daily marks, and the now routine excessive heat warnings going up across Oregon and Washington. By the summer of 2025, a heatwave in the Pacific Northwest was no longer a shocking novelty. It was just a thing that happened, more or less every year, that you braced for. But here's the detail from these recent years that I think matters most, and it's not the daytime peaks at all. It's the nights. I keep coming back to overnight temperatures, because they're the part that does the quiet damage, and the trend in them is clear and a bit alarming. The number of warm summer nights in the region has climbed sharply. There was reporting that drew on data showing cities across the area were averaging something like 27 warmer than normal summer nights as of recent years, compared to roughly one such night per year back in the 1970s, from one a year to nearly 30. And specific cities showed their average summer overnight low creeping up by several degrees over the decades. Seattle's up by getting on for 3 degrees Fahrenheit, Portland's by closer to 4, and some inland cities by even more. That might sound like a dull statistic next to a dramatic triple-digit afternoon, but it's arguably more important for human survival. And you already know why from earlier. The night is supposed to be the reprieve. It's when a body that struggled through a hot day gets to unload its heat and reset before the next one. When the nights stop cooling, that reset never comes. So a region with warmer nights is a region where the same daytime heat does more harm because nobody gets their recovery time. The Northwest isn't just getting hotter afternoons, it's losing its cool nights, and that's the change that quietly raises the danger of every heatwave that comes. There's a detail about the original 2021 event that's worth bringing in here, because it changes how you think about all these near misses, and it's oddly reassuring in one specific way. The 2021 heatwave was actually forecast well. The meteorologists saw it coming days in advance, and the warnings went out. The forecasting worked, and yet hundreds of people still died. That gap between knowing the heat is coming and actually preventing the deaths is the whole challenge in a nutshell. It tells you that the problem was never really that the weather caught everyone by surprise on a technical level. The forecast was good. The problem was that knowing isn't the same as being ready, and a region without the cooling, the habits, the systems, and the acclimatization can be told exactly what's coming and still not be able to stop it from being a disaster. So when the region brushes up against heat now in these recent summers, the question isn't whether they'll see it coming. They will. The question is whether everything downstream of the forecast, the cooling centres, the check-ins, the AC, has caught up enough to turn a good warning into actual lives saved. That's the real test, and it's a test that gets run a little more often every year. So when you put all of this together, 2022, 2024, 2025, the soaring count of 100-degree days, the vanishing cool nights, you get a picture that fits exactly what the projections said. The region keeps brushing up against serious heat. None of these has been another 2021, but they don't need to be, to make the point. They're the texture of a place settling into its new climate, the early, less extreme editions of the thing that scientists say will keep returning. It's a bit like hearing distant thunder more and more often. Not the storm itself, not yet, but a clear sign of the weather you now live under. Which raises a natural question. The same brutal weather pattern can hit different places and do very different amounts of harm, depending on how ready they are. We've touched on bits of why the Northwest is so exposed, the lack of AC, the cool climate houses, the unacclimatized bodies, but I'd like to pull all those threads together properly, because the reasons this region suffers more than you'd expect are worth understanding as a whole. So let's do that next. I want to gather up all the threads we've touched on about vulnerability and lay them side by side, because it's one thing to know each piece on its own, and another to see how they fit together into a region that's almost custom-built to suffer from heat, more than its temperatures alone would suggest. Think of it this way: the same heat wave that's a deadly disaster in one place can be a mildly annoying week in another. The weather is identical. What differs is everything the weather lands on. And the Pacific Northwest, for a whole stack of reasons, is a place where heat lands on soft ground. The first reason we've covered, and it's the foundational one: the houses. Generations of homes built for a cool, damp climate, designed to trap and hold warmth through chilly winters. That's exactly the wrong design when the threat flips to heat. A house that's good at holding warmth is a house that turns into an oven and won't let the heat back out at night. And crucially, so many of them had no air conditioning, because for 100 years there was no reason to fit it. We talked about Seattle having among the lowest rates of home air conditioning of any major American city. When the dome arrived, an enormous number of people simply had no mechanical way to cool the air around them, and a fan in genuinely extreme heat does very little except move hot air about. The second reason is the bodies, which we went through in the physiology section. An entire population with no heat acclimatization. People whose bodies had never been trained by a lifetime of hot summers to sweat efficiently and handle the cardiac strain. The same temperature is simply more dangerous to an unacclimatized body, and the whole region was unacclimatized at once. There's a researcher who made this point well, that people in regions like the Northwest aren't adapted to the heat and so are more susceptible to it, and that there's a much greater risk of heat injury and death in such areas precisely because the people aren't used to it. A 100-degree day in a place that gets them every year is a known quantity. The same day in a place that's never had one is a shock to every system, the human one included. The third reason is the demographics. We saw it starkly in who actually died. A lot of older people and a lot of people living alone. An older body is worse at every single step of cooling, slower to recognize it's overheating, sweating less, with a heart less able to handle the load. And someone living alone has no one to notice they've gone quiet and confused, no one to get them water or get them to a cool place. The combination of an aging population and a lot of solo living is, sadly, a combination that heat exploits ruthlessly. The people most at risk are often the least able to ask for help, and the least likely to have someone checking in. The fourth reason is the geography within the cities, the urban heat island business we touched on. The hottest neighbourhoods, the ones with the most pavement and the fewest trees, tend to be the lower income ones, and they run several degrees hotter than the leafy, shaded, wealthier parts of the same city. So within a single city, on a single, deadly night, you've got people living in genuinely different thermal worlds. One person is uncomfortable, but safe in a tree-lined street, while a few miles away, another person is in real danger on a treeless block of concrete and asphalt that's soaked up the day's heat, and is now radiating it back through the night. The danger isn't distributed evenly. It's concentrated, and it's concentrated on the people with the fewest resources to escape it. And then there's a fifth factor that sits underneath all of these, which is simply that nobody expected it. The cultural unpreparedness. There was no established habit of heat warnings being taken seriously, no widespread network of cooling centres ready to go, no ingrained instinct to check on the elderly neighbour during a hot spell, because there'd never needed to be one. The region had 100 years of evidence telling it that heat wasn't its problem, and that confidence, reasonable as it was, meant the systems and the habits that other hot regions take for granted simply weren't there when they were suddenly needed. You can't build the muscle memory for a hazard you've never faced. So you stack all five together. Houses that trap heat with no AC to fight it. bodies with no heat fitness, a population skewed older and more isolated, hot neighbourhoods concentrating the danger on the vulnerable, and a culture with no practice at any of this. That's not bad luck, that's a profile. It's the profile of a region where a given temperature does more harm than the same temperature would almost anywhere that's used to heat. The thermometer in Portland and the thermometer in Phoenix can read the same number and mean two completely different things because of everything sitting behind the number. The slightly hopeful flip side of all this, and I do want to end this section on it because it's true, is that almost every one of those 5 factors is something you can actually change. You can't change the weather that's coming, but houses can get cooling, habits can be built, warning systems can be set up, trees can be planted, vulnerable people can be checked on. The vulnerability isn't fixed, it's a to-do list. And in the years since 2021, the region has actually started working through that list, with real results in some places and real gaps still remaining in others. So let's finish the body of this with where things actually stand now, what's changed and what hasn't, because it's a more encouraging note than you might expect after everything we've been through. So let's talk about where things actually stand now, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that nothing was learned and everyone just shrugged and carried on. That isn't what happened. The 2021 event genuinely changed the region, and a fair amount of that change has been for the better. Start with the most direct response, which is air conditioning. The single biggest vulnerability was all those homes with no way to cool the air, and that has shifted, and shifted fast. In the years after the heat dome, air conditioning adoption across cities like Seattle and Portland climbed sharply. People who'd spent their whole lives proudly going without went out and got cooling because the 2021 event rewrote everyone's sense of what was possible. When you've watched your supposedly mild city post a number like that, the calculation about whether you need AC changes completely. So a lot of homes that had no mechanical cooling now have some. That on its own is the most important protective change there is, because it directly addresses the thing that killed the most people. It went beyond individuals buying units too. In Portland, for instance, there were moves to require cooling in newly built, subsidised housing, which matters enormously, because subsidised housing is exactly where you find a lot of the most vulnerable people, the older, lower-income residents, who are hit hardest. Writing cooling into the rules for new housing means future buildings won't repeat the deadly design of the past, at least not for the people the rules cover. It's the difference between hoping people protect themselves and building the protection into the place itself. Then there's the public infrastructure of a heat response, which barely existed before and has been built up since. Cooling centres, the public air-conditioned spaces where anyone can go to ride out a heatwave, regardless of what they have at home, have expanded and become a planned, organised part of how the region handles hot spells, rather than a frantic improvisation. Heat warning systems have improved, so people get more and clearer advance notice. And importantly, given what we learned about who dies, there's been real attention to check-in programs, organised efforts to reach out to isolated, elderly and at-risk people during heat events, because so many of the 2021 deaths were people alone with no one to notice they were in trouble. Building a system that deliberately reaches those people is one of the most valuable things a region can do, and it's exactly the kind of muscle memory the Northwest didn't have before. And here's the genuinely encouraging part. The reason none of this is just wishful thinking. We know preparation works because there's a clear real-world example of it working elsewhere. Back in 2003, a heatwave in Western Europe killed tens of thousands of people, with France hit especially hard. It was a national wound, and France responded properly. It built a heat warning system, set up plans to check on isolated elderly residents, opened cooled public spaces, and treated heat as a serious recognised hazard the way it would treat any other. And in the years since, during later heatwaves that were in some cases just as hot, the French death toll came down dramatically. That's not a model or a hopeful projection. That's a real country that took a real catastrophe, changed how it prepares, and saved thousands of real lives the next time the heat came. The tools work when you actually use them. So when the Northwest builds cooling centres and warning systems and check-in programs, that isn't busy work. It's the proven stuff. And I want to be honest here, rather than tying a neat bow on it, the work is far from finished, and some of the hardest parts remain hard. More homes have AC, but not all, and the people least likely to have it are still often the most vulnerable. And cooling that you can't afford to run is cooling that doesn't save you. So the cost of electricity during a long heat wave is a real barrier for low-income households, even when they own a unit. The grid itself is a genuine concern, because the hottest day, when everyone runs their cooling at once, is precisely the day the electrical system is under the most strain and most likely to fail, and a power cut during extreme heat removes the one defense people are relying on, all at once. The unhoused, who have no indoors to retreat to at all, remain desperately exposed, and the isolated elderly are, by their nature, the hardest group to reach, no matter how good the check-in programs get. So the honest summary is mixed, and I think mixed is the truthful place to land. The region is meaningfully better prepared than it was in 2021. The most important vulnerability, the lack of cooling, has genuinely improved. The systems and habits that were missing have started to grow, and France proves that this kind of preparation saves lives at scale. But the harder, deeper problems, the cost, the grid, the most vulnerable people, those haven't been solved, and they won't be solved quickly. The Northwest has done the easier, faster work, and it's left with the slower, harder work still ahead. What I find quietly reassuring in all of it, though, is the underlying point from the last section. Almost none of this is fixed by fate. The weather will do what the weather will do, but how much harm it causes is, to a real degree, up to the choices people make in the years between the events. The region has some agency here. It's already used some of it, and that, after everything we've talked about tonight, feels like a decent place to start winding down. So let me bring this back round to where we began, gently, and then let you go. We started way back at the top of all this, with the strangeness of where it happened. And I think that's where I want to leave you, because for all the science and the numbers and the projections, the thing that stays with me about this whole story is just how unlikely the setting was. The Pacific Northwest, the rainy bit, the land of drizzle and evergreens, and people who'd spent 100 years being right that they didn't need air conditioning. The last place on the continent you'd ever point to and say, that's where a heat catastrophe will happen. And then for a handful of days in the summer of 2021, it became one of the hottest inhabited places on Earth. A region built entirely around the gentle, forgiving weather it had always known, meeting weather it had never imagined, and discovering in the hardest possible way that the old confidence had quietly expired. I keep thinking about that mayor in the little canyon village, the one who said he'd thought climate change was a problem for the next generation, right up until he became the mayor of a town that no longer existed. Because in a way that's the whole thing in one sentence. Not a distant problem, not the next generations. His town, his watch, that week. The future arriving early and uninvited, and the people on the ground simply not having the reference points to see it coming, because nothing in 100 years of experience had prepared them for it. And that's really what the projections are telling us. Underneath all the percentages and the talk of 2-degree worlds, it isn't a prophecy of a specific summer. I said that at the start and I'll hold to it at the end, because I think the honesty matters more than the drama. Nobody can circle a date. What the science says is something quieter and, in its own way, harder to sit with. The thing that happened in 2021, the thing that was so rare it was very nearly impossible, has had its nature changed. It's moved from the column marked once in 1,000 years to the column marked expect it every handful of years. And it's done that within a span of time that plenty of people alive right now will live to see. The freak became a feature, and the region keeps getting its reminders, summer after summer, in the rising count of hot days and the slow disappearance of cool nights. So the real question the title points at was never whether the Northwest can get that hot. We know it can, because it already did. The question is only how ready the place will be the next time the dome settles in and the nights stop cooling and the old, the alone, and the unprepared are left, once again, in rooms that won't cool down. And the genuinely interesting part of that question, the part I find oddly steadying rather than only frightening, is that the answer isn't fixed. It depends on the cooling that gets fitted, the warning systems that get built, the neighbours who get checked on, all the unglamorous work that happens in the quiet years between the events. France showed it can be done. The Northwest has started doing it. Whether it does enough, fast enough, is still being decided right now by people who, unlike everyone in 2021, can at least see the thing coming. There's a strange comfort in that, I think. Not a cheerful comfort, but a real one. The generations before us lived with deadly heat and buried their dead, and mostly couldn't see the shape of what was happening to them. We can. We have the measurements, the maps, the studies, the clear-eyed warnings, and being able to see a thing coming is, for all that it's unsettling, the most useful thing you can possibly have, because you cannot prepare for a threat you cannot see. And this one, finally, we can. Anyway, that's where I'll leave it. A cool, green, rainy corner of the world that became, for a few days, the hottest place its people will ever stand, and that now has to learn to live as somewhere the heat comes back. There's something almost poignant about it. The place that was always defined by its gentle weather, having to redefine itself around the opposite. But places adapt, people adapt, and the canyon that lost its town will, eventually, have a town in it again. Thanks for spending this stretch of the night with me. Sleep well, wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next one.